attacks in Spain as it comes to hand. But right now I'm joined by a former Cabinet Minister in the British Labor government's Ed Balls, who is touring Australia to discuss all things to do with neoliberalism. Is it dead? Is it not dead? We'll get to that in a moment. But Ed, before we do, you would be very familiar, obviously, with Barcelona. It would have been a town that you would have visited. What is your reaction to these horrific events in the last 24 hours?
Well, like very many people with my children, we've walked down the Ramblas as tourists in Barcelona. And the thing which is so terrible about these terrorist attacks is the use of vehicles and targeting indiscriminately ordinary citizens, tourists going about their normal lives. It's so cruel and it's so destructive and it's so random. Of course, in Britain, we've had similar attacks in the last few months. We had the attack just outside our parliament by a terrorist, again, who had commissioned a car and then drove into tourists on the bridge in Westminster. We had the same thing happen at Finsbury Park in London. We had the terrible bomb attack at the concert in Manchester. And so I think everybody in Britain's hearts will go out to the people of Barcelona and the people who've lost their lives, and also the people who've been injured. I think also there'll be great solidarity with the very important work that the police in Barcelona are doing and have done to stop the second attack we now know. I think there will be an absolute determination in Britain and in Spain to say we are not going to change our lives or be defeated or be thrown off course by this terrible terrorism. And there needs to be even more international cooperation now within Europe, but also with America, with Australia. All of us are vulnerable to these kind of incidents, and we need to work together to improve our intelligence, to root out wherever we can and prevent these attacks. It's a terrible thing happening in our society in the 21st century, and but I think the first thing and the only thing to say is for those who've lost their lives, it's terribly sad, and our hearts go out to them.
Now, Brexit is, of course, one of the issues that you talk about in your work, and the political issues that are playing into that. When you look at this attack that has happened in Spain, you know, today, do you look back at anything, you know, over your years in government and say that was a mistake, we should have done more, we didn't see that coming? Issues in relation to the flow of people and border control within, you know, Europe, for example?
Well, I think the answer to that is yes. I should say, first of all, that an important part of the European Union has been close police and security cooperation to catch criminals, to target terrorism, and it is absolutely vital in our negotiations now, having voted to leave the European Union, that we don't in any way backpedal on that cooperation, because today's tragic events last night in Barcelona show how important it is that we continue to work together. But the truth is, last year in our referendum, the government campaigning to stay in the European Union said to the British people that even though public spending had been cut, wages had stagnated, inequality was rising, and there had been a great deal of migration coming into Britain on a much bigger scale than we anticipated, the government said to people, look, this is just the way it is, stick with the status quo, we can't really change things. And I'm afraid people voted to leave in a majority because they said, if it's only the status quo, then actually we'll gamble on change. And I think that's a really important lesson which we need to discuss in Britain, but also here in Australia, at a time when you more recently have seen your wages begin to stagnate, when inequality has been rising, with people on the highest income seeing their incomes shoot up and everybody else falling behind. You can't say to people, look, this is just as good as it gets, stick with the status quo. We've got to have a reform agenda in all our economies to get stronger growth, to get rising wage growth, to tackle inequality. That's a debate Wayne Swan, the former Treasurer, has been leading here in Australia in the last couple of years, and we're touring around talking about what our countries need to do to get growth and tackle inequality so that we can avoid the kind of short-termist, populist, potentially very damaging politics we've seen in Britain with our vote on Europe, but also we've seen with the election of Donald Trump in America.
Yeah, and you and your mate Wayne Swan have been talking about this. I mean, Labor's got a pretty ambitious agenda heading into the next election, don't they? They're not running exactly a small target strategy.
Well, Bill Shorten, I think, made a very important speech a couple of weeks ago saying that this now was going to be a central issue. And I would think the government needs to engage on this debate, because if you simply say, look, inequality, it's not a big problem, it's not something you need to worry about. As I said, you saw last year what happens when a government of the centre-right says, look, just stick with it, we can't do better than this. And I think there does need to be a debate now in Australia about what needs to be done. One of the very interesting things which I saw coming over to Australia earlier in the week was the IMF and the OECD both saying to Australia, if growth slows down this year and next, the government should use fiscal policy and stimulus to support growth and to keep the economy growing. Now, that was, I think, the right response to the global financial crisis in Britain and in Australia 10 years ago. I know it's been quite controversial in Australia, with Wayne Swan being attacked by some for that stimulus. It's interesting to see now even the international institutions saying, if the economy slows down, use fiscal policy and stimulus. It looks like that argument is starting to be won.
Yeah, and I heard you making the point that you think Australia did the right thing with that stimulus package in relation to the global financial crisis. But look, no interview with you is complete without asking you about your passion for dancing. Many of our viewers will remember your extraordinary turn. You really became a bit of a national hero, really, after a gentleman such as yourself showing that you had hidden talents. Tell us a little bit more about, do you still dance in any way when you're not on Strictly Ballroom Dancing or whatever the program was that you're on?
I've got to say, in all the interviews I've ever done, nobody has got from the global financial crisis and fiscal stimulus to the Paso Doble with such skill as a transition question than you just managed. So I want to congratulate you for that. The truth is I'm now a retired former professional dancer. So I've hung up my dancing shoes. Of course, weddings, funerals and bar mitzvahs after 10 p.m. I'll still be dancing with the other dads. But having done Gangnam Style Salsa on national television last autumn in front of 12 million people, I think sometimes you should quit while you're ahead.
Well, it's a national tragedy if you've given up dancing, perhaps an international one. It was spectacular. You doing Gangnam Style, unforgettable, and probably a career highlight, no doubt, for yourself as well. Thanks so much for your time today in Sydney, Ed Balls. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.